Welcome to the RF Berlin Forum on Migration. My name is Tim Phillips. Now, for 2 days, a group of researchers are meeting here in Germany's capital to discuss their research on the topic of migration. And it's a topic that these days gets attention from both public and policymakers. If you spend any time at all on social media, it sometimes feels like everyone has a strong opinion about immigrants and immigration these days, including many of the politicians you will find there. But are these strong views a new phenomenon? And is the polarized political discourse based on facts or assumptions? Leah Boustan of Princeton has researched the history of immigration and our attitudes to it, both in the US and Europe. Leah, hello, welcome.
Good to be here.
Leah, migration is a controversial topic at the moment. It's all over the news. Has it always been this way or is now different?
Well, in the United States, we're actually coming back right now to a climate that's very similar to what we went through 100 years ago. At the moment, 14% of the population in the US was born abroad. And the same thing was true around the year 1900. And the political climate today is very similar to what we saw at the time in terms of many politicians speaking very negatively about immigration. And actually what's different today, and perhaps quite surprisingly, is that we have some politicians now who are pro-immigration. So our parties are very polarized on this topic. And if you go back 100 years, it would be very hard to find any representative in Congress who is speaking favorably about immigrants.
Well, this is remarkable because you have done the work on the historical perspective on immigration. Your book, Streets of Gold, focused on looking at that long view. But as you say, at that time, there was still a substantial number of immigrants, and the United States was built on the success of immigration. But yet it's always been something where the political discourse has had a lot of opposition to immigration in it.
Well, that's right. Congress ended up closing the border substantially to migration in the 1920s. And the 1920s bill was actually their fourth attempt at closing the border. And they passed legislation 3 times before that ended up being vetoed by the president. So by the time 1924 came around, Congress was able to garner enough support to close the border so that they had a supermajority, 2/3 majority, to overturn that veto. And so we are in a situation now that we've been in before.
Tell me something about the experience of these immigrants from the early 20th century. We have an idea that it's a rags to riches story. Were they quickly able to succeed in the United States?
Well, what we set about to do in our book, Streets of Gold, was to compare immigrants from 100 years ago to immigrants today. And I think in the U.S., we have a shared nostalgic view about immigration in the past, a sense that immigrants themselves were able to move up from rags to riches and that their children were already set up in the middle class. But that today, immigrants are slower to assimilate and to achieve economically. And yet, when we look back in the data, we find that the pace of upward mobility was a lot slower in the past than we now think. With 100 years distance, we forget how slow the process was for immigrants from Europe. And it really wasn't until the children's generation that immigrant families were able to succeed economically. In fact, the pace of upward mobility is very similar today as it was in the past.
We also tend to compare different groups of immigrants, people who've migrated for different reasons and from different places. Also, historically, did you find that some groups assimilated and succeeded quicker than others?
Well, we find one aspect of the past particularly funny because in the first Trump administration, President Trump was said to have expressed a view that we need more immigrants from countries like Norway.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rena 9, and thank you for joining us. President Trump is under fire for comments that he reportedly made during an Oval Office meeting about immigration. A person briefed on the conversation says that the president grew frustrated today as he talked about protections for immigrants from places like Haiti and El Salvador, as well as countries in Africa, asking lawmakers, why are we having all these people coming from S-hole countries come here? We should bring in more people from places like Norway.
He specifically chose Norway as the example. It turns out that actually immigrants from Norway were the slowest to move up the ladder in the past.
Wow.
And their children were the slowest. And there's a very simple reason for this. Immigrants from Norway were primarily farmers, and they tended to move to the upper Midwest, to very cold areas that did not have rich farmland. And so when their kids grew up, they also would tend to take over the farm and again work in areas without particularly high remuneration. So the geography of where Norwegians settled and the occupations in the agricultural industry in which they found themselves were not the types of locations or occupations that led to rapid upward mobility. In fact, our sense of who succeeded and who were slower to succeed is not actually matching what's in the data. Today, there's also quite a lot of disparity across immigrant groups. Some are wildly successful and some are less so. But what's true of almost every immigrant group, immigrants from almost every country, is that they have higher rates of upward mobility than the children of similarly placed U.S.-born families. So if you're able to compare apples to apples and look at children raised in similar households with similar income, we find that almost every immigrant group shares higher upward mobility than the children of the U.S. born.
There has also been conflict because of the persistent narrative that immigrants are taking the jobs of the people who are already in the country. Was that always the same narrative? And what is the truth in that?
Well, interestingly, if you look at political speeches about immigration that are anti-immigration, you'll find that the topic of labor, are immigrants taking our jobs, and the topic of economics, like are immigrants taking more out of the social welfare system than they're paying in, are not really the main focus. So much of the anti-immigrant sentiment, both in the past and today, are about more cultural issues or about perceptions of disorder, that immigrants might be bringing crime or threats to the country. But, there certainly are some politicians and some voters who are concerned about whether immigrants take jobs. And the literature in economics is not completely uniform on this topic, but there are far more studies suggesting that immigrants are not competing with U.S.-born workers than the simple economic models would suggest.
You've also been involved in some work that is comparing these immigrant stories for different countries in the world. How has this come about? Who's involved?
A few years ago, with 3 co-authors in the U.S., we published a paper about upward mobility of children of immigrants in the U.S. past and present. After that paper came out, a few teams in Europe started to work on similar questions in their own home countries. And we began talking with the Danish team and comparing and contrasting the results that we found for immigrants who moved to Denmark relative to immigrants who moved to the U.S. We found some interesting differences, and it occurred to us, rather than have researchers go country by country, and then in 10 years' time, we might be able to compare across studies, we might as well join forces now. And so we put together a consortium of scholars. Altogether, we have 38 co-authors. Certainly, this is the largest team of researchers I've ever worked with. And in fact, when we tried to submit the paper as a working paper to certain research institutions, in some cases, they said, we don't have enough capacity in our database to fill in 38 co-authors. They managed to find a way, but it seems like it's more researchers than typical. And we're now able to compare and contrast the upward mobility of children of immigrants across 15 destination countries.
Generally speaking, is the U.S. experience of upward mobility typical?
Well, that's precisely the question that we set about to answer. And the answer is that the U.S. is not alone in having rapid upward mobility for both the sons and daughters of immigrants. In fact, what I would classify as the former British colonies experience very similar rates of upward mobility, and that includes Australia, Canada, and Israel. And in fact, as well, the United Kingdom itself. But where the differences lie is between that group of 5 countries and continental Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So the daughters of immigrants are experiencing upward mobility everywhere, but the sons of immigrants are falling behind the sons of local-born who were raised at the same point in the income distribution in all of the continental European countries that we look at.
Which is surprising in a way because European attitudes have generally been fairly positive towards immigration, have they not?
Well, that was a puzzle that intrigued us as well. So I've been working with a set of political scientists to compare the political speeches, at least the speeches that are offered in Parliament. Perhaps that's the speech of the elites, but the political speeches in the United States and in 8 European countries. And what we noticed is that the U.S. is the country with the largest spread among its mainstream parties in their attitudes towards immigration, with Democrats being very positive and Republicans being quite negative.
This is an America First bill. It secures America's southern borders.
Let's give them an opportunity to live another day.
But in the 8 European countries we considered, for the most part, we see political consensus rather than spread. In many countries, that's positive political consensus, with both the center-left and the center-right having very laudatory things to say about immigrants. In a few countries, it's somewhat more neutral consensus, but we don't see a lot of very negative attitudes towards immigrants expressed in the mainstream political parties, and we speculate that this may give some political space to far-right parties that have been growing in political power in many of the countries we consider.
You have filled our countries with illegal migrants with the blessing of Germany and France. We pay Islam that hates us out of our savings to turn our cities into ghettos.
Tell me a little bit more about this research. How were you able to do that? How are you able to extract meaning from what must be a very large number of speeches?
Well, we're talking about millions of speeches here.
Yes.
And the first question is a speech about immigration or is it about something else? Around 95% of speeches are about a totally different topic. And then once we find those, let's say, 5% of speeches that are about immigration, we need to classify them as pro or anti-immigration. When we started doing this work just for the United States around 3 or 4 years ago, the state-of-the-art methods were start with human beings, have humans read some subset of the speeches, small number, and then use large language models, basically the architecture underlying something like ChatGPT, to try to scale up the training data to the full corpus of speeches. But these days, ChatGPT itself has gotten so much better that our computer scientist friends told us, you can cut out the human altogether. And we really didn't believe them, but we gave it a try to compare the findings with our human-centered approach relative to ChatGPT alone, and we found out that they were completely right. So these days, it's the kind of process that anyone, an undergraduate or a graduate student could do with limited budget simply by writing a query to ChatGPT and feeding the speeches through ChatGPT, and at the end, building a data set that way.
So this polarization in the way that politicians address immigration in the United States, this is not a Trump-era polarization. This has always been in political speeches.
Well, in recent memory. So if you go back to the very beginning of our data set in the U.S. to 1880, what we see is not polarization, but rather we see 2 united parties, both very anti-immigration.
Right, yes.
And after World War II, this dynamic changed. Both Democrats and Republicans became more pro-immigration, and the border reopened to entry in 1965. But from that moment onward, polarization began, with Democrats more positive and Republicans more negative. In fact, we usually think of the era of polarization in the U.S. beginning in the 1990s, with Newt Gingrich, Contract with America.
Oh, yes.
And we see that polarization on immigration widens at that time, but it began much earlier. It began in 1965. Essentially, as soon as we started allowing immigrants in again, attitudes towards immigration began to separate.
And we're contrasting that, well, we're in Berlin today with the sort of political speeches that you hear from the main parties in the German parliament or at home. For me, in the UK, you'd hear in the UK parliament, there's much more consensus, is there? And that consensus is positive about the impact of immigration?
There's much more consensus. In the UK, it's very clearly a positive consensus for all of the three mainstream parties. For Germany, there's a little bit of a separation, with the Christian Democrats being somewhat more negative on immigration, but still on the positive side of the ledger. We don't see a party in those two countries that reflects a net negative attitude towards immigration, period, from around the year 2000 to today.
Now, recently, politics across Europe has changed quite dramatically, with new political parties becoming much more successful, and very often their success is motivated by anti-immigrant speech, catching those feelings within the electorate. Is this perhaps because that electorate has felt ignored in some way?
That's our sense of what might be going on. So many of the far-right parties that are gaining favor today entered parliament for the first time in the mid-2010s. And our sense is that as immigration ramped up in European countries, and particularly with the refugee crisis, the mainstream parties did not respond to the sentiment that was growing among the electorate of concern. In some case, simple concern, and in some case, alarm. But yet there was very little movement in the types of speeches you would hear among the mainstream.
Well, Leah, this is very interesting work. Are you going to carry on with this analysis? I imagine there is still a lot more data to unpack.
Well, it was very exciting to be able to reveal our work on European parliaments for the first time here at RF Berlin and get some good feedback from people in the audience. So we've just begun on that project, and we have a lot more to do with some good suggestions that we received from the audience here.
I look forward to hearing about it. Leah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Leah's book is called Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. The authors, Leah Boustan and Abramitzky. It was published by Public Affairs in 2022. For her research into political speeches, computational analysis of 140 years of US political speeches reveals more positive but increasingly polarized framing of immigration. The authors Dallas Card, Serena Chang, Chris Becker, Julia Mendelsohn, Rob Voigt, Leah Boustan, Abramitzky, and Dan Juravsky. And if you want to compare that to Europe, then the new paper is called Comparing Political Speeches About Immigration in US and Europe. Authors Abramitzky, Boustan, Danziger, Hedesheimer, and Wu, 2025.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.